Hi, folks. Thank you for stopping by. If you find these stories interesting, consider supporting the channel by leaving a like and consider subscribing. Now, let's jump into today's stories. Starting off, we have the case of Solomon Northup. Washington, D.C., 1841. It is a crisp April morning in 1841, and the streets of Washington, D.C. are humming with the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant ringing of church bells. Among the crowd walks a man who carries himself with an unmistakable air of dignity and purpose. He is tall, well-dressed, and possesses the calloused hands of a laborer but the sharp, observant eyes of an intellectual. His name is Solomon Northup. Solomon isn't a stranger to hard work, but today he feels a rare sense of optimism. With him, he carries a violin, an instrument that has provided him not just with a supplemental income, but with a sense of joy and artistic expression. Back in Saratoga Springs, New York, he has a wife and 3 children who are the center of his universe. He is a free man, born free in the North, living in a state where his liberty is protected by law. Or so he believes. He is currently in the company of 2 men he recently met, Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton. They had approached him in New York, claiming to be members of a traveling circus troupe. They spoke of lucrative performances in the nation's capital, promising Solomon wages that seemed almost too good to be true. Eager to provide a better life for his family, Solomon agreed to accompany them. For days, they have treated him with kindness, sharing meals and conversation. They even suggested he obtain papers proving his status as a free citizen before they crossed into the District of Columbia, a gesture that seemed like genuine concern for his safety. But as the sun begins to set over the Potomac, the atmosphere shifts. The 2 men invite Solomon to a tavern to celebrate their arrival. There is music, laughter, and a series of drinks. Solomon, usually a temperate man, feels a strange heaviness after only a few glasses. The room begins to tilt. The voices of Brown and Hamilton become distorted, echoing as if from the bottom of a well. His limbs feel like lead. A profound, unnatural lethargy washes over him, and as the darkness of the tavern floor rises to meet him, Solomon Northup loses consciousness. When he finally wakes, the world is silent, cold, and pitch black. He tries to reach out, but his wrists are bound. He tries to stand, but a heavy chain rattles against his ankles, anchored to a ring in the floor. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and human misery. This isn't a hotel room or a circus camp. This is a cellar, specifically the notorious Williams slave pen, located just blocks away from the United States Capitol building. The realization hits him like a physical blow. The circus performers were nothing more than lures. He has been drugged, robbed of his free papers, and delivered into the hands of human traffickers. The door to the cellar creaks open, letting in a sliver of blinding daylight. A man enters, James H. Birch. He is a man who deals in flesh and blood, a man for whom human beings are merely inventory. When Solomon tries to speak, to explain that he is a free citizen of New York, that there has been a terrible mistake, he is met not with reason, but with a paddle. Birch screams at him, calling him a liar. He insists that Solomon is a runaway from Georgia. Every time Solomon mentions his home, his family, or his freedom, the wooden paddle strikes. When the paddle breaks, Birch reaches for a heavy whip. The lesson is clear. In this place, the truth does not matter. To survive, Solomon must surrender his identity. He is no longer a husband, a father, or musician. To the men in this room, he is now Platt, a nameless piece of property to be sold to the highest bidder. Within days, Solomon is forced onto a ship named the Orleans. He is packed into the hold with dozens of others, men and women whose stories are just as heartbreaking as his own. As the ship moves down the coast toward Louisiana, Solomon stares out at the receding shoreline of the north, watching his life vanish over the horizon. He is being transported into the heart of the Deep South, a place where the laws he relied on have no reach, and where the sun shines on a landscape built on the very system that has stolen his breath. The New Orleans slave market is a place of clinical cruelty. Solomon is made to stand on a pedestal, to show his teeth, to jump and run to prove his vitality. He is eventually purchased by a man named William Ford. To Solomon's surprise, Ford is not the monster he expected. He is a preacher, a man who treats his laborers with a degree of humanity that is rare in the pine woods of the Red River. Under Ford, Solomon works as a carpenter and a lumberman. He even uses his ingenuity to build a raft system to transport lumber more efficiently, earning Ford's respect. For a brief moment, there is a flicker of hope. Perhaps he can earn enough or find a way to send word home. But the economy of the South is volatile, and Ford falls into debt to satisfy his creditors. He is forced to sell Solomon to a man named John Tibiats. If Ford represented the best of a broken system, Tibiats represents the absolute worst. He is a man of small stature and even smaller character, driven by a violent insecurity that he resents Solomon's intelligence and his superior craftsmanship. Tibiats looks for any excuse to exert dominance. One afternoon, a dispute over the size of nails used in a construction project boils over. Tibiats lunges at Solomon with an axe-i. In a moment of pure survival instinct, Solomon fights back. He overpowers his master, pinning him to the ground and whipping him with his own lash. It is an act of defiance that, in the 1840s South, is usually a death sentence. Tibiats returns later with 2 other men and a rope, intent on a public execution. They slip the noose around Solomon's neck and tighten it until he is standing on his tiptoes, choking, the tips of his toes barely brushing the dirt. He stays like that for hours in the sweltering heat, the sun beating down, his lungs screaming for air. He is only saved when Ford's overseer intervenes, reminding Tibiats that Solomon is technically still mortgaged to Ford and cannot be killed without a loss of property value. It is a chilling reminder. Solomon's life isn't saved because he is a human being. It is saved because he is a financial asset. Tibiats eventually sells Solomon to Edwin Epps, a man whose name would become synonymous with Solomon's darkest years. Epps is a cotton planter, and he is a man of erratic, alcohol-fueled rage. On the Epps plantation, life is measured in pounds of cotton picked per day. The quota is grueling that if a laborer falls short, the whip follows. Solomon, unaccustomed to the back-breaking rhythm of the fields, struggles to keep up. He witnesses horrors that defy description. The psychological breaking of men and the relentless, systemic abuse of women like Patsy, the plantation's most productive picker, who bears the brunt of Epps's twisted obsessions and his wife's jealous cruelty. Through it all, Solomon keeps one thing tucked away in the deepest recesses of his mind: his name. He never forgets who he is. He watches the seasons change, the cotton bloom and wither year after agonizing year. He looks for any opportunity to get a letter to the North, but the risks are astronomical. To be caught with writing materials is to invite a level of punishment that few survive. He once tries to trust a white laborer named Armsby, paying him with his meager savings to mail a letter. Armsby immediately betrays him to Epps. Solomon only escapes death by using his wits, convincing Epps that Armsby is lying to cause trouble. The years bleed into a decade. Solomon is nearing middle age. His children will be grown. His wife may have moved on, thinking him dead. The violin, which he was eventually allowed to play for Epps's dancing parties, becomes a bittersweet companion. It provides him a brief escape in a melody, but it also serves as a reminder of the life he lost. Then, in 1852, a man named Samuel Bass arrives at the plantation. Bass is a Canadian carpenter hired to help build a new house for Epps. He is an outspoken man, a man who doesn't hide his disdain for the institution of slavery. Solomon listens to Bass arguing with Epps, his heart hammering in his chest. For the first time in 12 years, he hears a voice that echoes his own buried beliefs. Solomon takes the ultimate gamble. He corners Bass in the dead of night and tells him the truth. He tells him about Saratoga Springs, about the tavern in Washington and the 10 years of silence. Bass is moved to tears. He agrees to help. The two men work in secret. Bass writes several letters to contacts Solomon provides in New York. They wait. Weeks pass, then months. Solomon watches the road every day, his hope a fragile, trembling thing. He knows that if these letters are intercepted, both he and Bass are as good as dead. Back in New York, the letters eventually find their way to the hands of Henry B. Northup, a lawyer and a member of the family that had once held Solomon's ancestors as bondservants, but had since become his friends and advocates. Henry is galvanized. He gathers affidavits, secures the support of the governor of New York, and heads south. In January 1853, a carriage pulls up to the Epps plantation. Inside are Henry Northup and a local sheriff. When they call for Solomon, the man known for 12 years as Platt steps forward. The confrontation is tense. Epps is furious, claiming he bought the man legally and that no Yankee lawyer can take his property. But the legal papers are irrefutable. Solomon identifies Henry, and the connection is undeniable. As Solomon climbs into the carriage, he looks back at the fields, at the people he is leaving behind. People like Patsy, for whom there is no rescue coming. It is a moment of profound joy marred by an unbearable weight of guilt and sorrow. Solomon Northup returns to New York a celebrity, but a scarred one. He reunited with and his children, who had indeed grown into adults. He seeks justice, attempting to sue the men who kidnapped him, but the laws of the time are stacked against him. Because he is a black man, he is barred from testifying against white men in a D.C. court. The kidnappers walk free. Solomon spends the next few years writing his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which becomes a sensation and a powerful tool for the abolitionist movement. He travels the country giving lectures, using his voice to ensure that the world knows exactly what is happening in the shadows of the South. But then the trail goes cold. Around 1857, Solomon Northup disappears from the public record. There are rumors. Some say he joined the Underground Railroad, helping others find the freedom he fought so hard to regain. Others fear he was kidnapped a second time, silenced by those who hated his message. To this day, the location of his grave and the circumstances of his death remain one of history's most haunting mysteries. Solomon Northup was a man who was stolen from his life, but he refused to let his soul be taken. He survived a decade of darkness through a combination of sheer will, intellect, and the undying memory of his own name. His story remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a chilling reminder of a time when freedom was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a drink, a lie, and a chain. Next story, The Enigma of the Admiral. Bridgeport, Connecticut, 1872. The night of June 3rd, 1872, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, was thick with the kind of coastal humidity that makes the air feel heavy, almost expectant. At around 11 p.m., the quiet of Clinton Street was shattered by the sharp, unmistakable crack of a pistol shot. To the few neighbors still awake, it was a startling intrusion into the peace of a prestigious neighborhood. To Captain George Musala's Calvic horses, it was the final, violent note in a life defined by extraordinary survival and high-seas adventure. When the first witnesses arrived at the scene, they found a distinguished, gray-haired man slumped on the sidewalk. He was dressed in a fine suit, but his clothing was disarrayed. His shirt was scorched, a small, dark hole burned through the fabric just over his heart. Blood pooled slowly beneath him on the flagstones. Beside him lay a bamboo sword cane, its blade unsheathed and glinting under the gaslight, and a heavy, double-barreled pistol. It was a scene of chaos that looked, at first glance, like a desperate street mugging gone wrong. But as the identity of the victim became clear, the local authorities realized they weren't just looking at a common crime. They were looking at the death of a national hero. George Calvic Horses was a man who seemed to have been born for the history books. Decades before he ended up on a Bridgeport sidewalk, he was a young boy in Greece, surviving the horrific Chios massacre during the Greek War of Independence. He had been captured by Ottoman forces, seen his family devastated, and was eventually ransomed and sent to the United States. He was a protege of Captain Alden Partridge, the founder of Norwich University, and eventually earned a commission in the United States Navy. His career was the stuff of legend. He had participated in the Wilkes Expedition, a 4-year voyage of discovery that mapped vast swaths of the Pacific and confirmed the existence of Antarctica. During the Civil War, he rose to the rank of captain, commanding ships that enforced the blockade of the South. By 1872, he was a retired admiral, a man of means, respect, and a seemingly stable family life. He was a pillar of the community, which made the circumstances of his death not just tragic, but baffling. The initial theory was simple: robbery. Calvacourses had been on his way to catch a late-night ferry to New York City. He was known to carry large sums of money, and it was widely believed that he had been accosted by a footpad, a 19th century term for a mugger. The admiral's leather pocketbook was missing. His watch chain had been snapped, and his gold watch was nowhere to be found. It seemed like an open-and-shut case of a high-profile theft resulting in murder. But as the investigators began to look closer at the physical evidence, the narrative of a robbery began to fray at the edges. First, there was the matter of the weapon. The pistol found next to the admiral was a peculiar, old-fashioned piece, a heavy, double-barrel percussion pistol. It was the kind of weapon a sea captain might own, but it wasn't the kind of tool typically used by common street criminals of the era, who preferred smaller, easily concealed revolvers. More curiously, the admiral's own sword cane was out of its sheath. If he had been surprised by a robber, he had seemingly had enough time to draw his blade and prepare for a fight. Yet, there were no signs of a struggle on his hands or body other than the fatal wound. Then, there was the wound itself. The ball had entered his chest at a perfectly horizontal angle, traveling straight through his heart. The scorching on his shirt indicated that the muzzle of the gun had been pressed directly against his skin or held within an inch of it. This wasn't the kind of shot a panicked robber takes from several feet away. This was an execution-style contact wound. The local police, led by a skeptical coroner, began to dig into the admiral's final days. What they found was a man acting with a strange, almost frantic deliberation. In the weeks leading up to that June night, George Calvacourses had been busy. He wasn't just tending to his gardens or visiting friends. He was visiting insurance agents. Over a relatively short period, the admiral had taken out multiple life insurance policies with several different companies. The total sum was staggering for 1872, roughly $195,000. In today's currency, that would be the equivalent of nearly $5 million. For a retired naval officer with a comfortable pension and significant real estate holdings, such a massive amount of insurance was highly unusual. Even more suspicious was a specific clause found in several of those policies. Many of them contained suicide clauses, which stated that the benefits would not be paid out if the policyholder took their own life. However, most of these clauses expired after 1 year. The admiral had been very careful to ensure that his policies were active and that any waiting periods for accidental death or homicide were accounted for. As the insurance companies caught wind of the admiral's death, they didn't see a tragedy. They saw a massive potential payout that they were desperate to avoid. They hired private investigators to look into the admiral's finances and his movements. The investigators discovered that Calvacourses had been leading a bit of a double life regarding his wealth. While he appeared prosperous, he had recently suffered significant losses in the stock market. His vast fortune was increasingly tied up in devalued securities. He was a man with a fierce sense of honor and a desperate need to provide for his large family, including his young second wife and several children. The prospect of leaving them in financial ruin would have been unbearable for a man of his temperament. Then, the timeline of the night of the murder began to look suspicious. Witnesses saw the admiral walking toward the docks, but he seemed to be lingering. He was seen at the local hotel, then near the train station, then doubling back toward Clinton Street. He was carrying a small black bag, a bag that was found near his body, but it didn't contain his missing valuables. Instead, it contained personal papers and, strangely, some heavy stones. The insurance companies proposed a scandalous theory. Captain Calvacourses had staged his own murder to ensure his family would receive the massive insurance payouts. The theory suggested that the admiral, realizing he was worth more dead than alive, had traveled to Bridgeport with a plan. He had allegedly purchased the old percussion pistol himself. He had allegedly broken his own watch chain and discarded his valuables in the river to make it look like a robbery. He had then stood on that quiet sidewalk, drawn his sword cane to create the illusion of a struggle, pressed the heavy pistol against his own chest and pulled the trigger. The public was outraged. The idea that a hero of the Navy, a man who had survived storms and battles, would end his life in such a deceptive way was seen as an insult to his character. His family vehemently denied the suicide theory, pointing to the missing money and the fact that the admiral was a man of deep faith and iron resolve. They argued that he had simply been the victim of a calculated ambush. The case went to a coroner's jury, and the proceedings were a media circus. Medical experts were called to testify about the nature of the wound. Some argued that it was physically impossible for a man to hold such a heavy, long-barreled pistol against his own chest and fire it at that specific angle. Others pointed out that the admiral's arms were long enough, and the recoil would have sent the gun landing exactly where it was found. The missing pocketbook became a central point of contention. If it was a suicide, where was the money? The insurance investigator suggested he had hidden it or thrown it away, but a search of the area and the nearby waters yielded nothing. However, a few days after the funeral, a local boy found the admiral's gold watch lying in the grass near the crime scene. It hadn't been stolen, it had been dropped or tossed. To the insurance companies, this was the smoking gun. A robber takes the watch. A man staging a crime discards it nearby to make the scene look messy. The legal battle that followed lasted for years. The insurance companies refused to pay, citing the evidence of suicide. The Calvacourses' family sued for the full amount. The trials featured high-powered lawyers and conflicting testimonies from ballistics experts, many of whom were pioneered during this very case. In fact, the Calvacourses case is often cited in legal and forensic history as one of the first major instances where life insurance litigation hinged entirely on forensic reconstruction of a crime scene. In the end, the courts largely sided with the family. The burden of proof for suicide was high, and the insurance companies couldn't definitively prove that the admiral had pulled the trigger himself. While some companies settled out of court, others were forced to pay the full policies. The family received enough to maintain their status and security, but the admiral's reputation remained clouded by the Bridgeport mystery. Even today, historians and true crime enthusiasts are split. Was George Calvacourses a victim of a random act of violence on a dark Connecticut street? Or was his final act his most daring maneuver? A calculated sacrifice to save his family from the shame of poverty? The scene on Clinton Street offers two different stories. In one, we see an aging hero, tired and cornered by debt, using his knowledge of firearms and tactics to execute a perfect, tragic deception. In the other, we see a brave veteran, surprised in the dark, drawing his sword one last time to defend his life and his property, only to be cut down by a nameless assailant who vanished into the foggy night. The admiral was buried with full military honors in Litchfield, Connecticut. His tombstone reflects his service and his rank, but it says nothing of the mystery that ended his life. He remains a figure of immense historical importance, yet his greatest enigma isn't found in the charts of the Pacific or the logs of the Civil War. It is found in the scorch marks on a silk shirt and a broken gold chain left in the grass. Whether it was a murder or a final desperate act of love for his family, the death of George Calvacourses remains one of the most intriguing cold cases of the 19th century. It is a story of how a man's public legacy can be overshadowed by the private pressures of a changing world, and how the truth can sometimes be buried just as deeply as the secrets we keep. Next story, the Black Donnellys. Lucan, Ontario, 1880. The air in the township of Biddulph was never truly still. Even in the dead of winter, when the snow muffled the sound of wagon wheels and the wind howled through the skeletal trees of the Canadian wilderness, there was a vibration in the earth. It was the friction of a community divided, a resentment that had been simmering for 30 years, waiting for a single spark to turn a frontier settlement into a slaughterhouse. To understand what happened on the night of February 4th, 1880, you have to understand the Roman line. This was a stretch of road near the village of Lucan, settled largely by Irish immigrants who had fled the famine and the crushing poverty of the old country. They brought with them their faith, their work ethic, and their ancient, jagged feuds. Among these settlers were James and Johanna Donnelly. They were a tall, robust couple who had carved a homestead out of the dense woods, raising 7 sons and 1 daughter. But in Biddulph, the Donnellys weren't seen as hard-working pioneers. To their neighbors, they were the Black Donnellys, a name that carried the weight of a curse. The trouble didn't start with a murder. It started with a land dispute. In 1847, James Donnelly had settled on a piece of land that he believed was his for the taking. When the rightful owner attempted to reclaim it, James didn't back down. The dispute culminated at a logging bee, a community gathering meant for labor and celebration. In the heat of an argument fueled by whiskey and long-standing pride, James struck a man named Patrick Farrell with a handspike. Farrell died from his injuries, and James Donnelly became a fugitive. He spent nearly a year hiding in the woods, allegedly dressed in women's clothing to evade the law, before finally surrendering. He was sentenced to death, but Johanna, a woman of legendary iron will, walked over 30 miles to deliver a petition for clemency. The sentence was commuted to 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary. By the time James returned, his sons had grown into men. They were strong, athletic, and fiercely loyal to one another. They were also, by most accounts, incredibly provocative. The Donnelly boys, Will, Tom, John, Mike, Robert, and James Jr., didn't just live in Biddulph, they dominated it. They ran a stagecoach line that competed aggressively with local rivals. They were accused of burning barns, hamstringing livestock, and beating those who crossed them. Whether they were truly the criminals the town claimed, or simply the scapegoats for every misfortune in the county, is still debated today. But in the eyes of the township, they were a cancer that needed to be cut out. As the 1870s drew to a close, the atmosphere in Lucan turned toxic. A group known as the Biddulph Peace Society was formed. On paper, it was a neighborhood watch meant to curb the lawlessness of the area. In reality, it was a vigilante mob, led by a local constable and sanctioned by a bitter local priest who had publicly denounced the Donnellys from the pulpit. The society began to meet in secret, fueled by a shared hatred and the belief that the legal system would never be enough to stop the Donnelly family. The winter of 1880 was particularly harsh. On the night of February 3rd, the Donnelly homestead was quiet. James and Johanna were home, as was their son Tom and their young niece, Bridget, who had recently arrived from Ireland. A family friend and farmhand named James Donegan was also staying on the property. The family was preparing for a court date the following morning. They had been accused of arson yet again, a charge they claimed was fabricated. They had no idea that while they slept, a mob of nearly 30 men was gathering at the Cedar Swamp schoolhouse, drinking heavily and arming themselves with clubs, shovels, and pitchforks. Shortly after midnight, the mob approached the Donnelly cabin. They moved through the shadows, their breath hitching in the freezing air. Leading them was James Carroll, a man who had been appointed constable specifically to bring the Donnellys down. He entered the house first, claiming he had a warrant for Tom Donnelly's arrest. James and Johanna, weary but accustomed to late-night harassment from the law, didn't resist. They sat by the fire as Tom began to dress. Then the world turned red. Without warning, Carroll signaled the men waiting outside. They burst through the door, a wave of shadow and steel. The cramped cabin became a tomb. James Donnelly, now an old man in his late 60s, was struck down where he sat. Johanna, the matriarch who had fought for her family for decades, was beaten with a shovel. Bridget, the young cousin who had only been in Canada for a few months, fled upstairs, screaming in terror as the mob pursued her. Tom Donnelly, the most physically imposing of the brothers, fought like a lion, but he was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. He was handcuffed and then struck repeatedly until he fell. As the family lay dying or dead on the floorboards, the mob didn't stop. They dragged the bodies into the center of the room. They ransacked the house, looking for any other family members. Then, they took kerosene lamps and set the cabin ablaze. The dry wood caught instantly. The orange glow of the fire lit up the snow-covered fields of the Roman line, a beacon of brutality that could be seen for miles. But the night wasn't over. The mob had a list. They moved 2 miles down the road to the home of William Donnelly, what was considered the brain of the family, and the mob viewed him as their primary target. They surrounded his house and began shouting for him to come out, claiming there was a fire at his father's place. Inside, Will was asleep with his wife and his brother, John. Hearing the commotion, John stepped out onto the porch to see what was happening. The mob, thinking John was William, opened fire. Multiple bullets tore through John's chest. He slumped against the doorframe and fell back into the house, dying in his brother's arms. Will, realizing this was an ambush, stayed low to the floor, peering through a window. He recognized the faces of the men in the yard, men he had known his entire life. He watched as they waited for him to emerge, and when he didn't, they eventually dispersed into the night, satisfied that they had finished the job. The next morning, the township of Biddulph woke up to a changed world. The Donnelly cabin was a smoldering heap of ash and bone. The bodies of James, Johanna, Tom, and Bridget were so badly burned that they were barely recognizable. The news of the massacre sent shockwaves across Canada and the United States. It wasn't just the scale of the violence. It was the fact that it had been carried out by a coordinated group of respectable citizens. The legal proceedings that followed were a mockery of justice. Despite the fact that William Donnelly could identify several members of the mob, and despite the testimony of a young boy named Johnny O'Connor, who had been hiding under a bed in the Donnelly cabin and witnessed the entire massacre, no one was ever convicted. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial, held in a different venue, resulted in an acquittal for all defendants. The atmosphere in the courtroom was one of intimidation. Witnesses were threatened, and the local community remained silent, bound by a pact of blood and a collective sigh of relief that the Donnellys were gone. The Peace Society had achieved its goal, and the law was powerless to hold them accountable. The story of the Black Donnellys didn't end with the burials. For over a century, the massacre remained a taboo subject in Lucan. People didn't talk about what happened on the Roman line. The families of the mob members stayed in the area, their secrets passed down in whispers. The Donnelly name became a ghost story, a warning to those who would defy the social order of a small town. But as the years passed, the narrative began to shift. Modern historians and true crime enthusiasts began to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. They saw a family that was certainly rough and perhaps criminal, but they also saw a family that was targeted by a prejudiced religious and social hierarchy. The Donnellys were victims of a frontier justice that was neither just nor peaceful. Today, a simple gravestone stands in the St. Patrick's Cemetery in Lucan. It marks the final resting place of James, Johanna, and their children. For years, the original headstone bore the word murdered, but it was eventually replaced by a more neutral marker after the original was vandalized and chipped away by souvenir hunters. Next story, the murder of Agent Huber J. Tracy Jr. Abingdon, Virginia, 1942. The Appalachian Trail in southwestern Virginia is known for its rolling fog and dense, silent timber. It is a place where, in the early 1940s, the world felt very far away, even as the drums of the Second World War beat loudly across the oceans. But on a crisp March day in 1942, the violence of the era didn't come from a foreign battlefield. It came from a small, nondescript hotel in the town of Abingdon, and it targeted a man whose job was to maintain the very order that felt so fragile. Huber J. Tracy Jr. was a man who commanded respect without having to demand it. A graduate of Georgetown Law, he was brilliant, athletic, and possessed a quiet intensity that made him a perfect fit for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By March 13, 1942, Tracy had been with the Bureau for about 3 years. He wasn't just a desk agent. He was a man of action, often tasked with the gritty, high-stakes work of tracking down those who thought they could slip through the cracks of a nation distracted by war. On this particular Friday, Tracy and his partner, Agent Charles L. Amory, were on the hunt. Their targets were 2 men who represented a specific brand of American desperation: deserters. In 1942, walking away from your military post wasn't just a crime. It was seen as a betrayal of the highest order. The men they were looking for were Ned S. Heffrown and his companion, a man who had already proven that he had no intention of following the rules of a civilized society. The agents had received a tip that the fugitives were holed up at the Belmont Hotel. In the 1940s, hotel was often a generous term for small-town boarding houses, and the Belmont was no exception. It was a place of creaking floorboards and thin walls, where secrets were hard to keep but easy to bury. Tracy and Amory arrived in Abingdon with the confidence of federal officers who had done this 100 times before. They coordinated with local law enforcement, but as was often the case with the FBI during the Hoover era, the Bureau agents took the lead. They entered the hotel, their coats heavy with the weight of their service revolvers, their eyes scanning the lobby for anything out of place. They were directed to a room on the second floor. The plan was simple, a standard knock and announce. In a perfect world, the door would open, the suspects would see the badges, and the handcuffs would click shut without a word. But the men inside that room, Ned Heffrown and his accomplice, were not interested in a perfect world. They were cornered animals, and they knew exactly what awaited them if they were taken back to a military stockade. As Tracy and Amory approached the door, the air in the narrow hallway felt thick. Tracy took the lead. He knocked. He identified himself. He didn't get an answer in words. Instead, he got the sound of movement, quick, frantic scuffling behind the wood. The door didn't just open, it exploded outward. In the cramped confines of the doorway, a chaotic struggle erupted. Tracy, ever the athlete, moved to subdue the suspect, but the man, Heffrown, wasn't just resisting, he was fighting for his life. In the blur of limbs and the shouting of orders, a weapon appeared. It wasn't a standard military rifle or a heavy pistol. It was a small, easily concealed firearm that should have been harmless compared to the firepower the agents carried. But at point-blank range, there is no such thing as a harmless gun. A shot rang out, muffled by the proximity of the bodies, but sharp enough to echo through the entire hotel. The sound was followed by a moment of sickening silence. Agent Tracy staggered back. The bullet had found its mark in a way that defied the odds of a frantic scuffle. It struck him in the chest, piercing his lung and severing a major artery. Amory, seeing his partner collapse, engaged in a desperate fight to secure the suspects, but the damage was done. Tracy lay on the floor of that dingy hallway, the life literally pouring out of him. Local doctors were rushed to the scene, and for a few agonizing hours, the town of Abingdon held its breath. Tracy was a young man, only 27 years old, with a bright future and a family who expected him home. He fought with the same tenacity he brought to his cases, but the wound was catastrophic. Hubert Tracy Jr. died that evening, becoming one of the relatively few FBI agents at that time to fall in the line of duty. The news sent shockwaves through the Bureau. J. Edgar Hoover, a man not known for his sentimentality, but deeply protective of his agents, was reportedly incensed. The killing of a federal agent was an affront to the very fabric of the FBI. The manhunt that followed wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message. Ned Heffrown and his associate didn't get far. The weight of the entire federal government descended upon the Virginia countryside. Within hours, the perimeter was sealed. Roadblocks were set up on every winding mountain pass. The local community, outraged by the cold-blooded murder of a man who was just doing his job, joined the search. When the suspects were finally apprehended, the true nature of their desperation became clear. These weren't criminal masterminds. They were young men who had buckled under the pressure of the war and made a series of increasingly violent choices to avoid the consequences of their first mistake. But in the eyes of the law, their motivations mattered far less than their actions. The trial was swift, as justice often was in the 1940s. The evidence was irrefutable. Agent Amory provided the harrowing testimony of the struggle in the hallway, and the physical evidence, the gun, the ballistics, the location of the wound, pointed directly to a deliberate act of lethal resistance. But while the legal system moved forward, the FBI was mourning a brother. Tracy wasn't just a statistic. He was remembered by his colleagues as a man's man, someone who was as comfortable analyzing a legal brief as he was chasing a suspect through the woods. He was the embodiment of the G-Man image that the public had come to idolize: brave, clean-cut, and unwavering. The murder of Agent Hubert J. Tracy Jr. changed the way the Bureau approached routine apprehensions. It served as a grim reminder that there is no such thing as a routine arrest when you're dealing with people who feel they have nothing left to lose. The protocols for entering confined spaces and dealing with deserters were tightened. The Bureau began to emphasize even more rigorous combat training, ensuring that agents were prepared for the split-second violence that could erupt in a hotel hallway or a dark alley. Today, if you visit the FBI Academy at Quantico, you will find Tracy's name on the Wall of Honor. It stands as a silent testament to a young man who gave everything for a cause he believed in. In Abingdon, the Belmont Hotel is long gone, replaced by the modern facade of a town that has moved on from the 1940s. But for those who know the history, that stretch of road carries a certain weight. It's a reminder of a time when the world was at war, and a different kind of battle was fought in the quiet corners of America. A battle for law, for order, and for the lives of the men who swore to protect it. The story of Hubert Tracy is a tragedy of timing. He was a man built for the challenges of his era, cut down before he could see the victory his country was fighting for. He left behind a legacy of service that continues to inspire agents today, a reminder that the cost of safety is often paid by those who are willing to step into the doorway when everyone else is backing away. The echoes of that single gunshot in 1942 might have faded, but the impact of that moment, the loss of a brilliant mind and a brave heart, remains a permanent chapter in the history of American law enforcement. It is a story of a life ended too soon and a duty fulfilled to the very last breath. Next story, the Krupp Diamond Theft. Las Vegas, Nevada, 1959. The desert air in the late 1950s was different than it is today. In 1959, Las Vegas wasn't yet the sprawling neon metropolis of the 21st century. It was an oasis of high-stakes gambling, rat pack glamour, and a particular kind of lawlessness that thrived under the scorching Nevada sun. It was a place where you could reinvent yourself, or if you weren't careful, lose everything you had in a single night. At the center of this world was the Desert Inn, one of the crown jewels of the Strip, a place where the elite came to play. And in the fall of 1959, the most elite guest in the house was a woman named Vera Krupp. Vera Krupp was the epitome of old world wealth married to new world ambition. As the wife of Alfred Krupp, the German industrial titan whose steel empire had fueled the machinery of 2 world wars, she was accustomed to a level of luxury most people couldn't fathom. Even after their divorce, Vera lived a life defined by opulence. She had retreated to a massive ranch outside of Vegas, but she frequently stayed at the Desert Inn to enjoy the nightlife. She was often seen draped in furs and dripping with jewels, but there was one piece of jewelry that stood above the rest. It was a 33.19 carat Asher-cut diamond, a stone so clear and so massive it looked like a block of ice frozen in time. It was the Krupp diamond, and it was worth a fortune, nearly $300,000 in 1959 money, which would be millions today. On the evening of October 30th, 1959, Vera was in her ranch house, a sprawling property known as Spring Mountain Ranch. She was having dinner with her foreman. The desert was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and expectant. Vera, as she often did, was wearing the diamond ring. To her, it wasn't just an investment, it was part of her identity. But that identity made her target. She didn't know that for weeks, eyes had been watching the ranch. Men who didn't care about the history of the Krupp Empire or the beauty of the Asher cut. They only cared about the price tag. The peace of the evening was shattered when 3 men forced their way into the ranch house. They weren't master thieves from a Hollywood caper. They were desperate men, masked and armed. They moved with a frantic energy that made them even more dangerous. They quickly overpowered the foreman and cornered Vera. They didn't want the silver. They didn't want the cash in her purse. They wanted the big one. The robbery was swift and brutal. They tore the ring from Vera's finger, along with other pieces of jewelry, totaling over $300,000. To ensure their escape, the thieves used grocery twine to tie Vera and her foreman to chairs. They even ripped the phone lines from the walls. A classic move to buy time before the authorities could be alerted. As the sound of their getaway car faded into the desert wind, Vera Krupp sat in the dark, her hand feeling strangely light, the ghost of the diamond's weight still pressing against her skin. It took over 6 hours for Vera and the foreman to break free. By the time the police arrived, the trail was cold. The thieves had vanished into the vast, empty Nevada night. The local sheriff's department was outmatched. This wasn't a common cattle rustling or a bar fight. This was a high-stakes heist involving one of the most famous gemstones in the world. The FBI was called in, led by none other than J. Edgar Hoover's hand-picked agents. The pressure was immense. If a woman as prominent as Vera Krupp wasn't safe on her own ranch, no one was. The investigation initially hit a wall. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses other than the victims, and no immediate leads. The thieves had been smart enough to wear masks and gloves. However, they made the mistake that almost all thieves make. They had to sell the prize. A diamond that large is impossible to move through legitimate channels. You can't just walk into a pawn shop with a 33-carat stone and expect no questions. You have to go to the underworld, and the underworld is a place built on whispers. The FBI began a massive dragnet, monitoring known jewel fences from Los Angeles to New York. They knew that a stone of this caliber would likely be broken down, recut into smaller stones to hide its origin. It was a race against time. If the Krupp diamond was recut, the evidence of the crime would be lost forever, and its value would plummet, but the thieves would be safe. The break in the case didn't come from a high-tech forensic discovery. It came from the oldest trick in the book, a tip from a disgruntled associate. An informant in New Jersey reached out to the FBI, claiming he had heard about a massive diamond being shopped around the East Coast. The descriptions matched the Krupp diamond perfectly. The feds tracked the lead to a small-time criminal named James Reeves. Reeves wasn't a mastermind. He was a bridge between the street-level crooks and the higher-level fences. The FBI coordinated a sting operation. They followed the trail to a hotel in Newark, New Jersey. In a scene that could have been pulled from a film noir, agents closed in on a group of men attempting to finalize a deal for the stone. When the dust settled, the FBI had recovered the diamond. It was found tucked away in a grocery bag, hidden behind a toilet in a nondescript apartment. The world's most famous diamond, worth a king's ransom, had been reduced to a piece of contraband hidden in a bathroom. The arrests followed quickly. John Reeves, his brother Morris Reeves, and several accomplices were taken into custody. As the details emerged, the story became even more bizarre. The thieves had spent weeks scouting the ranch, even posing as census takers to get a look at the layout and Vera security. They had planned the heist with a mixture of meticulous detail and amateurish execution. They had the stone, but they had absolutely no idea how to actually profit from it without getting caught. The trial was a media sensation. Vera Krupp, ever the stoic, testified with a composure that commanded the courtroom. She wanted her diamond back, but more than that, she wanted justice for the violation of her home. The defendants tried to argue various technicalities, but the evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had tracked the movements of the jewelry across state lines, turning a simple robbery into a federal racketeering case. The men were sentenced to long prison terms, and the Krupp diamond was returned to its rightful owner. But the story of the diamond didn't end with the trial. Vera Krupp continued to wear the ring until her death in 1967. She had it modified, adding a secret compartment or a more secure setting, but she never let the robbery scare her into hiding it in a vault. To her, the diamond was a symbol of survival. When she passed away, her estate put the jewel up for auction. The year was 1968, and the auction at Sotheby's in New York drew the attention of the world's wealthiest collectors. But one man was determined to own it. Richard Burton, the legendary actor known for his booming voice and his tempestuous relationship with Elizabeth Taylor, wanted the ultimate gift for his wife. He outbid everyone, including Harry Winston, eventually securing the stone for $305,000. When Elizabeth Taylor received the ring, it became the Elizabeth Taylor diamond. She wore it everywhere, on film sets, to the Oscars, even while doing mundane tasks. She famously said that it was her favorite piece because of its exquisite chemical purity and the way it captured the light. The stone that had been ripped from a woman's hand in a dusty Nevada ranch had become the most famous accessory of Hollywood's golden age. Decades later, after Elizabeth Taylor's death, the diamond was auctioned once more. In 2011, it sold for a staggering $8.8 million. The price reflected not just the quality of the stone, but the incredible narrative attached to it. It was a stone that had survived the collapse of an industrial empire, a violent desert heist, an FBI manhunt across the United States, and two of the most famous owners in history. The 1959 Krupp diamond theft remains a pivotal moment in Las Vegas history. It was the moment the city realized it was no longer a small desert town where what happens here stays here. It was a player on the world stage, attracting the kind of high-stakes crime that required federal intervention. For Vera Krupp, the theft was a traumatic interruption of her quiet life. For the FBI, it was a showcase of their ability to track professional criminals across the country. And for the diamond itself, it was just one chapter in a long, glittering history that continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and jewelry lovers alike. Looking back at the case, you see the intersection of different worlds. You have the remnants of European aristocracy in Vera, the grit of the American criminal underworld in the Reeves brothers, the rising power of federal law enforcement, and eventually, the glamour of Hollywood. The thieves thought they were stealing a ring, but they were actually stepping into a spotlight they weren't prepared for. They underestimated the power of the object they held. A 33-carat diamond isn't just carbon, it's a beacon. And in 1959, that beacon led the law straight to their door, ensuring that while they might have held the Krupp diamond for a few weeks, its story would belong to history long after they were gone. The ranch at Spring Mountain still stands, now a state park. Visitors can walk the grounds where the thieves once lurked in the shadows. The desert wind still blows through the canyons, carrying the echoes of a night when the silence was broken by demand for a big one. It serves as a reminder that even in the most isolated places, wealth brings a certain kind of gravity, a pull that attracts both admiration and envy, and sometimes a violence that changes the course of a life forever. The Krupp diamond is now in the hands of a private collector. Its location is secret, but its legacy remains etched into the lore of the American West, a tale of brilliance, greed, and a chase that spanned continent. Next story, the murder of Judge Richard Vance. Frankfort, Kentucky, 1989. The evening of November 6, 1989, was typical for the quiet, rolling hills of Frankfort, Kentucky. The air was crisp with the onset of late autumn, and the state capitol was settling into its usual nighttime rhythm. For Richard Vance, a respected 48-year-old district judge, it was a night meant for domestic routine. He had spent the evening at home with his wife, and around 9:30 p.m., he decided to perform a small, mundane chore, taking out the trash. He stepped out of his house on Deepwood Drive, a comfortable suburban street where neighbors knew each other and crime was something that happened elsewhere, or at least something Richard Vance dealt with from the safety of a mahogany bench in a courtroom. He never made it back inside. A single gunshot shattered the silence of the neighborhood. When his wife rushed outside, she found Richard lying near the end of their driveway. He had been shot once in the chest with a .22 caliber firearm. There was no sign of a struggle, no missing wallet to suggest a robbery gone wrong, and no getaway car scene speeding into the night. It was a surgical, cold-blooded execution on a quiet suburban lawn. In an instant, the state of Kentucky was shaken to its core. The murder of a sitting judge isn't just a homicide. It's an assault on the very architecture of the law. As investigators descended on Deepwood Drive, the initial confusion was palpable. Richard Vance was not a man known for having enemies. He was described by colleagues as fair, meticulous, and deeply committed to the community. In the world of true crime, we often look for a shadow life, a secret debt, an affair, or a hidden vice. But for Richard Vance, there was none. He was a devoted family man and a pillar of the legal establishment. This left the Kentucky State Police with a daunting reality. If the motive wasn't personal, it had to be professional. When a judge is killed, the suspect list is theoretically as long as their docket. Every person Richard Vance had sentenced, every disgruntled litigant who felt slighted by a ruling, and every criminal he had sent to jail became a potential lead. The police began the monumental task of scrubbing years of court records. They looked for threats, for outbursts in the gallery, and for individuals recently released from custody who might be harboring a lethal grudge. For weeks, the investigation moved at a grueling pace with very little to show for it. The .22 caliber bullet recovered from the scene was a common round, difficult to trace without the specific weapon. There were no fingerprints, no DNA in an era where such science was still in its infancy, and no eyewitnesses. The case began to grow cold almost as quickly as the Kentucky winter set in. Rumors swirled through the state house and the local diners. Was it a hit ordered by a drug syndicate? Was it a random act of violence? Or was there someone closer to the bench who wanted Vance out of the picture? The breakthrough didn't come from a forensic lab or a high-speed chase. It came from the shadows of the Kentucky underworld through the mouth of an informant. Information began to trickle in about a man named Gary Edward Moore. Moore was a local figure with a lengthy criminal history, but he wasn't someone Richard Vance had recently sentenced. In fact, on the surface, there was no direct link between the two men. However, the name Moore began to appear alongside another name that sent chills through the investigative team: Joseph Butch Girdler. To understand why these names mattered, you have to understand the climate of the region at the time. There was a certain good old boy network that occasionally blurred the lines between the law and the lawless. As the police dug into Gary Moore's life, they found a web of connections that led back to a stunningly brazen conspiracy. It wasn't just about one disgruntled man. It was about a group of individuals who believed they could manipulate the scales of justice through blood. The theory began to take shape. Moore hadn't acted alone, and he hadn't acted out of a personal vendetta against Vance. Instead, investigators began to suspect that the murder was a contract of sorts, but not in the way you see in Hollywood movies. It wasn't about money. It was about a favor intended to clear a path for someone else. The investigation revealed that Moore had been pressured or recruited by a man named James Big Jim Doss. Doss was a local businessman with significant influence and a history of legal troubles. He was facing a series of charges and believed that Judge Vance was a hanging judge who would not show him leniency. The plan, as it began to emerge from witness statements and mounting circumstantial evidence, was terrifyingly simple. Eliminate the judge who wouldn't play ball and hope the replacement would be more reasonable. In 1991, nearly 2 years after the trigger was pulled on Deepwood Drive, the state finally brought charges. Gary Moore was identified as the gunman, but the prosecution knew that Moore was just the hand. They needed the head. They charged James Doss with orchestrating the hit. The trial that followed was a media sensation in Kentucky. It peeled back the curtain on a world of backroom deals, intimidation, and the terrifying realization that a public official could be targeted simply for doing their job with integrity. Witnesses testified to the atmosphere of fear Doss created. They spoke of conversations in dimly lit bars and rural outposts where the life of a judge was weighed against the inconvenience of a prison sentence. The prosecution argued that Moore had been the one to pull the trigger, lurking in the darkness of the Vance property, waiting for that mundane moment when the judge would step outside to discard the evening's trash. However, the legal road to justice was not a straight line. The first trial of Gary Moore ended in a conviction, but the case against the alleged mastermind, Doss, proved more difficult to cement. The defense argued that the case was built on the testimony of jailhouse snitches and criminals looking to trade information for shorter sentences. They painted Moore as a lone actor or suggested that the police were so desperate to solve the murder of one of their own that they were willing to pin it on anyone with a record. Years of appeals and legal maneuvering followed. The Vance family was forced to relive the tragedy over and over in the headlines. But as the 1990s progressed, the weight of the evidence held firm. Gary Moore remained behind bars, eventually admitting to his role in the killing. The narrative that solidified was one of a senseless tragedy. Richard Vance had died, not because of a grand conspiracy involving millions of dollars or international intrigue, but but because of the petty, desperate fears of a few men who thought they were above the law. The legacy of the Richard Vance case changed the way the Kentucky judiciary approached security. It ended the era of innocence for local judges who felt safe in their own driveways. It served as a grim reminder that the road provides no physical protection against a person determined to subvert the system. Today, the name Richard Vance is often spoken in legal circles as a symbol of judicial integrity. He was a man who performed his duties without fear or favor, and ultimately, it was that unwavering commitment to the law that made him a target. The quiet street in Frankfort has long since returned to its peaceful state, but the memory of that November night remains, a moment when the darkness reached out from the shadows to try and extinguish the light of the court. In the end, the system that Richard Vance served did its job. The investigation was slow, the trials were grueling, and the appeals were long, but the truth was eventually laid bare. The men responsible were removed from the streets, and while no verdict could bring the judge back to his family or his bench, the conviction served as a final, definitive ruling. In the state of Kentucky, the law would not be intimidated, and justice for Richard Vance would be served. Next story, the murder of Janet Marshall. Was France, 1955. The summer of 1955 was supposed to be a season of liberation for Janet Marshall. At 29 years old, she was a woman who embodied a certain quiet, post-war independence. A schoolteacher from Nottingham, England, she was known by her colleagues and students as methodical, kind, and possessed of a subtle, adventurous streak. She had spent the last few years teaching at a primary school, saving her pennies for a grand solo tour of the French countryside. This wasn't just a holiday, it was a pilgrimage of sorts. She wanted to see the cathedrals, the rolling hills of the Oise region, and the quiet villages that felt worlds away from the industrial hum of the English Midlands. On a bright morning in late August, Janet checked out of her hostel, adjusted the straps of her heavy rucksack, and set off on her bicycle. She was heading toward Paris, but she wasn't in a hurry. The journey was the destination. She was a seasoned traveler, used to the curiosity her solo status sometimes provoked in rural Europe. To the locals in the small hamlets she passed, she was La Belle Anglaise, the beautiful Englishwoman with the sensible shoes and the bright, inquisitive eyes. On August 28th, Janet was seen cycling through the village of Laineville. It was a scorching day, the kind where the air feels heavy and still, shimmering over the asphalt. Witnesses recalled seeing her pedaling steadily, her blonde hair caught in a modest headscarf, looking every bit the picture of a peaceful tourist. She stopped briefly to ask for directions, her French polite but accented. No one who saw her that afternoon could have guessed that within 24 hours, her name would be headlined in every major newspaper across Western Europe. The following morning, a local farmer was moving his livestock near a dense thicket of trees known as the Wood of Bones, just off the main road between Laineville and Crile. The area was isolated, a patch of tangled brush and ancient oaks that provided deep shade even in the midday heat. As he walked near the edge of a ditch, he spotted something bright and out of place against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. It was a bicycle leaning haphazardly against a tree. A few yards away, scattered in the dirt, were personal items, a map of France, a small camera, and a notebook. Then he saw her. Janet Marshall lay in the undergrowth, her body positioned in a way that suggested a violent struggle. It was immediately clear to the farmer and later to the gendarmerie that this was not a robbery gone wrong. While some of her belongings were disturbed, the primary motive was far more sinister. Janet had been beaten severely about the head and neck, but the cause of death was manual strangulation. The brutality was shocking for such a tranquil, rural setting. The Wood of Bones, a name that had always felt like a relic of local folklore, suddenly lived up to its grim reputation. The investigation began under a cloud of intense international pressure. Only 3 years earlier, France had been rocked by the Drummond murders, a case where a prominent British scientist and his family were slaughtered while camping in Provence. The French authorities were desperate to avoid another diplomatic nightmare. They needed to find Janet's killer, and they needed to do it quickly. The lead investigator, Commissaire Chenevier of the Sûreté Nationale arrived on the scene with a reputation for being one of France's most dogged detectives. He looked at the crime scene and saw a killer who was both impulsive and incredibly lucky. There were no fingerprints on the bicycle. The ground was too dry to yield distinct boot prints. The only physical evidence was a few strands of hair caught in Janet's hand, evidence of her final, desperate fight for life, and a series of strange sightings in the hours leading up to the discovery. As the police began canvassing the surrounding villages, a profile of a suspect started to emerge. Several locals reported seeing a man lurking near the roadside that afternoon. He was described as swarthy, with a rugged, unkempt appearance, wearing a distinctive leather jacket despite the heat. Even more chilling, a local woman reported that a man matching that description had followed her for several miles only a day before Janet arrived, only veering off when she reached the safety of her farmhouse. The manhunt centered on the transient population of the Oise Valley. In the mid-50s, the region was a hub for itinerant laborers and men moving between the industrial centers of the north and the capital. The police rounded up hundreds of suspects, questioning anyone who couldn't account for their whereabouts on the afternoon of the 28th. Among those brought in for questioning was a 32-year-old man named Robert Avril. Avril was a man who lived on the fringes of society. He was a manual laborer with a history of petty theft and a reputation for a volatile temper. When the police first approached him, he was calm, too calm perhaps. He claimed he had been nowhere near the Wood of Bones. He told the investigators he had spent the day working and then drinking at a local cafe. But when the detectives checked his alibi, it began to crumble. The cafe owner remembered him, but not for the afternoon in question. More importantly, witnesses who had seen the man in the leather jacket near the crime scene were brought in for a lineup. One by one, they pointed to Robert Avril. The pressure in the interrogation room was immense. Chenevier was a master of the long game, allowing suspects to talk themselves into corners. He confronted Avril with the inconsistencies in his story. He showed him photographs of Janet, the vibrant woman on her bicycle versus the broken figure in the ditch. Avril remained defiant for days, but the weight of the witness testimony and the discovery of a blood-stained shirt in his lodgings began to break his resolve. Finally, in a low voice, Avril began to speak. He didn't offer a grand confession of a mastermind. Instead, he described a moment of dark, opportunistic predation. He had been walking along the road, frustrated and aimless, when he saw Janet. She was alone, she was foreign, and in his mind, she was an easy target. He claimed he had only intended to talk to her, perhaps to ask for money, but when she rebuffed him and tried to cycle away, something in him snapped. He described dragging her into the woods, the frantic struggle, and the moment he put his hands around her throat to make her stop screaming. To Avril, the life of the young teacher was a secondary concern to his own immediate, violent impulse. He left her there among the trees, taking only a few trifles from her bag before vanishing into the night. The trial of Robert Avril became a sensation in France and the United Kingdom. It was seen as a test of the French justice system's ability to protect foreign visitors. The defense tried to argue that Avril was a product of his environment, a man broken by the hardships of post-war life and possessed of a diminished mental capacity. They portrayed him as a beast of burden who hadn't understood the gravity of his actions. However, the prosecution painted a very different picture. They highlighted the predatory nature of the attack, how he had waited by the road, how he had chosen an isolated spot, and how he had used overwhelming force against a woman who weighed barely 100 pounds. They argued that Avril wasn't a man who had lost control. He was a man who had finally exercised the absolute control he craved over another human being. The jury didn't take long to reach a verdict. In May 1958, Robert Avril was found guilty of the murder of Janet Marshall. While many expected the death penalty, the guillotine was still very much in use in France at the time. The court sentenced him to life in prison with hard labor. The decision was met with mixed emotions in England. For Janet's family, no sentence could bring back the woman who had simply wanted to see the world. Robert Avril would eventually die in prison, a footnote in the annals of French crime. But the case of Janet Marshall lingered in the public consciousness for decades. It changed the way solo travel was perceived, casting a long shadow over the romanticized idea of a European road trip. Today, if you travel through the Oise region, the Wood of Bones is still there, though the roads are wider and the cars move much faster. The ditch where Janet was found has long since been covered by falling leaves and new growth. There is no grand monument to her, but her story remains a harrowing reminder of how a journey fueled by light and curiosity can be ended by a chance encounter with the dark. Janet Marshall was a woman ahead of her time, a teacher who wanted to learn from the world, only to become the central figure in a lesson about the unpredictable nature of human cruelty. Next story, the murder of Albert Richardson. New York City, 1869. The gas lamps of Manhattan's Printing House Square cast long, flickering shadows across the cobblestones on the evening of November 25th, 1869. It was Thanksgiving night, a time for reflection and family. But the air inside the offices of the New York Tribune was thick with the scent of ink, tobacco, and an unspoken tension that had been simmering for years. Albert Richardson, one of the most celebrated journalists of his era, was a man who had survived the horrors of the Civil War, escaped from a Confederate prison, and trekked across the Wild West. He was a man who lived by the pen, but on this night he would find that the sword, or rather, the pistol, was far more final. At around 5 o'clock, the heavy doors of the Tribune office swung open. A man stepped inside, his face obscured by the collar of his coat and the brim of his hat. He didn't look like a typical holiday visitor. He looked like a man with a singular, violent purpose. He moved toward the counter where Richardson stood, busy with the mundane tasks of a high-ranking editor. There was no exchange of pleasantries, no heated argument that preceded the climax. There was only the sudden, metallic flash of a revolver and the deafening crack of a gunshot that echoed through the marble halls of the newspaper building. Albert Richardson collapsed, clutching his abdomen as the stranger turned and walked calmly back out into the New York night. It was a shooting that would not only end the life of a brilliant writer, but would spark a legal and social firestorm, challenging the very Victorian definitions of honor, marriage, and the lengths a man could go to protect his property, even when that property was a human being. To understand why a man would walk into a crowded newspaper office and gun down a public figure in cold blood, we have to look back several years to a time when the lines between theater and reality began to blur. The story doesn't start with a murder. It starts with a woman named Abby Sage. Abby was a talented actress and a woman of significant intellect, a rarity in an era that preferred women to be decorative and silent. In the early 1860s, she was trapped in a marriage that was, by all contemporary accounts, a living nightmare. Her husband was Daniel McFarland, a failed lawyer and frustrated politician with a volatile temper and a devastating addiction to the bottle. McFarland was a man who felt the world owed him a living, and when the world failed to provide, he took his frustrations out on the person closest to him. The domestic life of the McFarlands was a cycle of verbal abuse and physical intimidation. Abby, desperate to support her children and find some semblance of peace, sought work in the theater and through public readings. It was during this period of professional striving that she met Albert Richardson. Richardson was everything McFarland was not: successful, stable, kind, and deeply respectful of Abby's talents. He saw her not as a subordinate, but as an equal. As Abby's marriage continued to disintegrate, Richardson became her confidant and, eventually, her beacon of hope. He helped her find work, offered her a shoulder to lean on, and promised her a life away from the shadows of McFarland's rage. By 1867, Abby had finally reached her breaking point. With the support of influential friends, including the famous editor Horace Greeley, she moved out of the home she shared with McFarland and eventually sought a divorce in Indiana, one of the few places at the time where such a thing was legally feasible. But Daniel McFarland did not see a woman seeking freedom. He saw a man stealing his rightful possession. In McFarland's mind, Albert Richardson hadn't saved Abby. He had seduced her. He hadn't offered her a new life. He had destroyed McFarland's home. The Victorian legal code and social mores of the time often viewed a wife as an extension of her husband's legal identity. To McFarland, Richardson was a thief of the highest order, and the currency he had stolen was McFarland's honor. For 2 years, McFarland stalked the periphery of their lives. He sent threatening letters, he hovered around the Tribune offices, and he made his intentions known to anyone who would listen. He was a ticking clock, and everyone in their social circle knew it. Richardson, perhaps emboldened by his own brushes with death during the war, underestimated the depth of McFarland's obsession. He believed that in a civilized society, the law and common decency would protect them. He was tragically mistaken. After the shooting on Thanksgiving night, the scene inside the Tribune was one of chaos. Richardson was carried to a nearby hotel, the Astor House, where doctors fought to save his life. The bullet had done catastrophic damage to his internal organs. As he lay dying, a remarkable and controversial event took place. Richardson and Abby Sage, realizing their time together was being cut short by minutes and hours, decided to marry. In a room filled with witnesses, including the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, the two were wed in a deathbed ceremony. It was a final act of defiance against the man who had tried to tear them apart. Albert Richardson succumbed to his wounds a few days later. His death was a national sensation, but the real drama was only beginning. The trial of Daniel McFarland, which began in April 1870, would become one of the most famous trials of the century. It wasn't just a trial for murder, it was a trial of the American family. The defense team, led by a shrewd and aggressive lawyer named John Graham, didn't try to argue that McFarland hadn't pulled the trigger. There were too many witnesses for that. Instead, they leaned into a defense that was both brilliant and deeply cynical: the unwritten law. They argued that McFarland had been driven to a state of temporary insanity by the destruction of his home. They painted Richardson as a libertine and a homewrecker who had used his wealth and influence to lure a weak woman away from her devoted husband. The courtroom became a theater of Victorian morality. Graham didn't just defend McFarland. He put Abby Sage on trial. He scrutinized her letters, her career in the theater, and her abandonment of her husband. He argued that McFarland's violence was a natural, almost biological response to the ultimate provocation. According to this logic, a man had a right, even a duty, to defend the sanctity of his marriage with lethal force. The prosecution tried to keep the focus on the facts. A man had walked into a place of business and committed a premeditated assassination. They presented evidence of McFarland's long history of abuse, his alcoholism, and his repeated threats against Richardson's life. They argued that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated execution. However, the social climate of 1870 worked in McFarland's favor. The mid-19th century was experiencing a backlash against the burgeoning women's rights movement. The idea of a woman choosing to leave her husband, especially for another man, was seen by many as a threat to the very foundations of society. The unwritten law whispered to the all-male jury that if McFarland could be punished for this, then no man's home was safe. The jury deliberated for barely 2 hours. When they returned with a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, the courtroom erupted in cheers. McFarland was treated not as a murderer, but as a folk hero who had stood up for the sanctity of the hearth. He was briefly sent to an asylum, only to be released mere weeks later, deemed cured of the insanity that had conveniently only manifested at the moment he pulled the trigger. The aftermath of the trial was a bitter pill for the progressive circles of New York. The verdict sent a chilling message. A woman's testimony and her right to safety were secondary to a husband's perceived honor. Abby Sage Richardson, now a widow and a social pariah to many, was forced to rebuild her life in the shadow of this injustice. She would go on to become a successful author and lecturer, never wavering in her defense of the man she loved or the choices she made. Daniel McFarland, meanwhile, faded into an obscure and miserable existence, eventually dying in relative poverty, his victory in court failing to bring him the respect or stability he craved. The murder of Albert Richardson remains a haunting chapter in American history. It serves as a stark reminder of a time when a law was often used as a tool to enforce patriarchal control, and insanity was a convenient mask for domestic vengeance. It was a case where the victim was blamed for his own death because he dared to offer a hand to a woman in a cage. As we look back at those flickering shadows in the Tribune office, we see more than just a crime. We see the violent friction of a society struggling to decide who truly owns a person's life and heart. The legacy of the case eventually contributed to a slow, arduous shift in legal thinking. The public outcry from the more progressive sectors of society helped highlight the absurdity of the unwritten law. It began a long conversation about the necessity of protecting individuals within the marriage contract and the realization that honor could not be used as a license to kill. But for Albert Richardson, those changes came much too late. He remains a figure frozen in that moment of 1869, a man of words silenced by a bullet, a casualty of a war that was fought not on battlefields, but in the darkened hallways of the American home. In the end, the story of Albert Richardson is not just about a murder. It's about the cost of freedom. It's about a woman who dared to want more than a life of fear, and a man who was willing to stand by her, even when the world told him it was none of his business. It's a story that reminds us that progress is often paid for in blood, and that the good old days were often only good for those who held a gun. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the Astor House where Richardson died was eventually demolished, and the Tribune building itself changed hands many times. The physical locations of this tragedy are gone, replaced by the towering steel and glass of modern Manhattan. But the questions raised that Thanksgiving night about the nature of obsession, the limits of the law, and the definition of a broken home still echo through our courtrooms and our culture today. Next story, the murder of Jeroboam Beecham. Frankfort, Kentucky, 1825. The air in Frankfort, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1825 was thick with more than just the smell of curing tobacco and the damp chill of the Kentucky River. It was heavy with the suffocating weight of political warfare. The state was torn apart by the old court-new court controversy, a bitter struggle between debt-ridden farmers and the banking elite. Men carried pistols in their waistcoats and daggers in their boots, not for protection against the wilderness, but for protection against their neighbors. Yet, the most famous death of that year would not occur on a battlefield or a dueling ground. It would happen in the quiet of a bedroom, born from a dark promise made in the name of a woman's shattered honor. To understand why a young, promising lawyer like Jeroboam Beecham would risk his life and soul, we have to look at the man he targeted, Colonel Solomon P. Sharp. Sharp was the Attorney General of Kentucky, a man of immense intellect and even greater ambition. He was a titan of a new court party, a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as future governors. But behind the polished veneer of a statesman, rumors swirled like silt in a storm. Years earlier, a woman named Anna Cook had been a jewel of Frankfort society. She was intelligent, fiercely independent, and beautiful. But then, she vanished from the social circles. She retreated to her mother's farm in Bowling Green, a recluse shrouded in scandal. The rumor was that she had been seduced and abandoned by Solomon Sharp, and that she had given birth to a child who did not survive. In the early 19th century, this wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a social death sentence. Anna Cook lived in the shadows, her life defined by a quiet, burning resentment. Enter Jeroboam Beecham. He was a law student, younger than Anna, and by all accounts, he was captivated by her legend before he ever met her. He sought her out, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of a misplaced sense of chivalry. When he finally stood before her, he didn't find a broken woman. He found a woman whose intellect matched his own, but whose spirit was tempered by a singular, cold ambition, revenge. When Beecham asked for her hand in marriage, Anna Cook gave him a condition that sounds like something out of a Greek tragedy. She told him she would never marry him until he killed the man who had wronged her. She wanted the blood of Solomon Sharp. Beecham didn't flinch. In his mind, he wasn't becoming a murderer. He was becoming a knight-errant. He accepted the terms. He spent the next few years honing his skills, finishing his legal studies and waiting for the perfect moment. He even attempted to challenge Sharp to a formal duel, but Sharp, sensing the volatility of the young man, refused to engage. To Sharp, Beecham was an irritant, a ghost from a past he had worked very hard to bury. The marriage finally took place in 1824. The pact was sealed. The couple lived in a strange sort of domesticity built upon a foundation of planned homicide. By late 1825, the political climate provided the perfect cover. Sharp was running for a seat in the legislature, and the vitriol between the parties was at an all-time high. If Sharp were to die, many would assume it was a political assassination. On the night of November 6, 1825, Jeroboam Beecham arrived in Frankfurt. He didn't check into a prominent in where he might be recognized. He moved through the shadows of the Capitol like a specter. He knew Sharp's house. He knew the layout of the rooms. He waited until the city fell silent, until the lamps were extinguished and the only sound was the rustle of dead leaves on the cobblestones. Around midnight, there was a knock at Solomon Sharp's door. Sharp, perhaps expecting a late-night political messenger or a constituent, rose from his bed and went to the door. He asked who was there. A voice from the darkness claimed to be a friend, a man named Covington. When Sharp opened the door, he found himself face to face with a masked figure. In the dim light, Beecham revealed himself. He dropped the mask of the stranger and whispered his real name. He wanted Sharp to know exactly who was killing him and why. Before Sharp could cry out or retreat, Beecham lunged. He used a specially prepared knife, a single, devastating strike to the abdomen. Sharp collapsed, the life draining out of him on his own doorstep. His wife, Eliza, rushed to the scene, her screams piercing the night, but the killer was already gone. He vanished into the Kentucky darkness, heading back toward his home, believing he had finally fulfilled his bride's grim request. The aftermath was immediate chaos. The city of Frankfurt erupted. Because of the political tension, the new court party immediately accused their rivals of hiring an assassin. They saw Sharp as a martyr. The old court party, meanwhile, pointed to Sharp's personal history, suggesting his private sins had finally caught up with him. The investigation didn't take long to circle back to Beecham. His obsession with Anna Cook was well known. His previous attempts to duel Sharp were on the record. Within days, authorities arrived at the Beecham estate. Jeroboam and Anna were both arrested. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational events in the history of the young American Republic. It wasn't just a murder trial. It was a public dissection of honor, seduction, and the lengths to which a man would go for love, or what he perceived to be love. The prosecution painted Beecham as a cold-blooded killer, driven by a fanatical wife. The defense tried to frame it as a matter of justifiable vengeance, an act of a husband protecting the sanctity of his home, even if the wrong had happened years before the marriage. Throughout the trial, Anna Beecham was a figure of intense fascination. She sat in the courtroom, stoic and unrepentant. She didn't view herself as a conspirator in a crime. She saw herself as a woman who had finally achieved justice in a world that offered her none. The evidence was overwhelming. Beecham had left a trail of witnesses who had seen him in Frankfurt. The physical evidence, including the knife and certain articles of clothing, tied him directly to the scene. Despite his legal training and his attempts to craft a perfect alibi, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to hang, but the story doesn't end with a simple execution. The Beecham Sharp tragedy, as it came to be known, moved into its final, most macabre act. While in prison, Jeroboam wrote a lengthy confession. He didn't write it to beg for mercy. He wrote it to justify himself to the world. He wanted everyone to know that he killed Sharp for Anna. He wanted the world to see him as a hero of romance. Anna stayed with him in his cell, the two of them existing in a dark, claustrophobic bubble of their own making. They decided they would not let the state have the final word. They planned a double suicide. They didn't want the hangman's noose to be the thing that ended their story. On the morning of the scheduled execution, the guards found them. They had both taken laudanum, but it hadn't been enough to kill them. It only made them sick. When that failed, they turned to a smuggled knife. Anna stabbed herself in the abdomen, mirroring the wound Jeroboam had given Sharp. Jeroboam also turned the blade on himself. When the jailers rushed in, they found a scene of absolute horror. Anna was dying, her life's blood pooling on the floor of the cell. Jeroboam was severely wounded, but still alive. The authorities, desperate to ensure that the law was carried out, didn't wait for him to heal. They didn't even wait for him to be able to walk. In one of the most gruesome displays in Kentucky history, Jeroboam Beecham was carried to the gallows. He was too weak to stand, so he was supported by the guards. He was executed while his wife lay dead back in the prison. They were buried together in a single coffin in Bloomfield, Kentucky. On their tombstone, at Anna's request, an 8-stanza poem was engraved, celebrating their love and their victory over their enemies. They saw themselves as martyrs to a code of honor that the rest of the world called murder. The case shook the foundations of Kentucky society. It led to a temporary cooling of political tensions, as both sides were horrified by the lengths to which the animosity had gone. It inspired writers for generations, from Edgar Allan Poe to Robert Penn Warren. It became a piece of American folklore, a cautionary tale about the intersection of private vengeance and public life. Solomon Sharp was buried with the honors of a statesman, but his legacy was forever tarnished by the scandal that led to his death. Jeroboam and Anna Beecham achieved a kind of immortality, but it was an immortality of blood and tragedy. They left behind a story that reminds us that when honor is divorced from morality, it becomes a very dangerous thing indeed. The Kentucky soil eventually reclaimed them all, the politician, the lawyer, and the woman who set them against each other. But the echoes of that knock on the door in the middle of a November night still linger in the history of the Bluegrass State. A reminder of a time when a promise made in the name of love could lead straight to the grave. Next story, the case of the Bodle family. Plumstead, Kent, 1833. The morning of November 2nd, 1833, began like any other in the village of Plumstead. The air was biting and damp, smelling of the Thames and the wood smoke of early winter fires. In the Bodle household, the patriarch, George Bodle, was a man of considerable standing. At 80 years old, he was a wealthy retired farmer, a man whose life had been defined by the acquisition of land and the stern management of his family. He lived in a comfortable farmhouse with his wife, his son John, his daughter-in-law, and several grandchildren. But on this particular Saturday, the domestic peace was shattered by a sudden, violent illness that seemed to strike the family out of nowhere. It started with the morning coffee. George Bodle, as was his custom, sat down for his breakfast. Within an hour of finishing his cup, the old man was doubled over in excruciating pain. It wasn't just a stomach ache, it was a physical assault from within. He was seized by violent vomiting and internal burning that left him gasping for air. Soon, he wasn't alone. His wife, Mary, and several other members of the household who had shared the morning brew began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. The farmhouse, once a symbol of rural stability, became a house of groans and desperation. In the 1830s, medical science was a blunt instrument. When the local apothecary was summoned, the initial thought was a localized outbreak of cholera or perhaps severe food poisoning. But as the hours ticked by and George Bodle's condition worsened, a darker suspicion began to take root. This wasn't the slow decline of age or the predictable path of a seasonal virus. This was sudden. This was concentrated. And for George Bodle, it was becoming fatal. The old man lingered in agony for several days, his body withering under the strain of constant purging. By the following Monday, George Bodle was dead. Death in the 19th century was common, but the circumstances surrounding the elder Bodle's passing were too suspicious to ignore. The local authorities were called, and a post-mortem examination was ordered, a rarity for the time unless foul play was strongly suspected. What the surgeons found inside George Bodle's stomach would change the course of forensic history. They found traces of a gritty, white substance. Even with the limited tools of the era, the diagnosis was clear: arsenic. As the investigation opened, the focus naturally turned to the household. Who had access to the kitchen? Who had a motive to see the wealthy old farmer dead? The eyes of the village and the law quickly landed on one individual, George's grandson, John Bodle Jr. Young John was 20 years old and, by most accounts, the black sheep of the family. While his grandfather was a man of discipline and thrift, John Jr. was known for his love of the high life, or at least the high life a village like Plumstead could offer. He was fond of gambling, frequented the local alehouses, and was perpetually short of money. He lived under the thumb of a grandfather who held the purse strings tight and showed little patience for his grandson's perceived laziness. The tension between the two had been a matter of public record. Witnesses recalled John Jr. complaining about his grandfather's longevity, making callous remarks about how the old man lived too long and how much better life would be once the inheritance finally moved down the line. It was the classic motive, greed fueled by resentment. The evidence against John Jr. began to mount with chilling speed. A local chemist came forward, testifying that just days before the poisoning, a young man matching John's description had purchased a significant quantity of arsenic, claiming it was needed to kill rats in the family barns. Furthermore, a search of John's coat pockets revealed traces of a white powder. When tested, it was a match for the poison that killed his grandfather. In the eyes of the community, the case was open and shut. Here was a rebellious youth, eager for his inheritance, who had cold-bloodedly poisoned the family's morning coffee, indifferent to the fact that his grandmother and other relatives might also die in the process. He was arrested and charged with the murder of George Bodle. However, the trial of John Bodle Jr. would not be the straightforward affair the prosecution expected. It became a landmark moment in legal history because of a man named James Marsh. Marsh was a chemist working at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich. He was called upon by the prosecution to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the substance found in George Bodle's body was indeed arsenic. At the time, the standard test for arsenic was the yellow precipitate test. It involved passing hydrogen sulfide gas through the suspect liquid. If arsenic was present, a yellow sediment would form. During the trial, Marsh performed this test for the jury. He showed them yellow results. He explained the science. But then, the defense struck a blow that echoed through the courtroom. They argued that the test was unreliable. The yellow sediment was unstable. It would fade or change over time. It wasn't unique enough to satisfy the high stakes of a capital murder charge. The jury, confused by the technicalities and hesitant to send a young man to the gallows based on a fading yellow cloud, returned a verdict that shocked the gallery. Not guilty. John Bodle Jr. walked free. He left the courtroom a man cleared by the law, even if the stench of suspicion followed him like a shadow. For James Marsh, the verdict was a personal and professional humiliation. He knew John Bodle Jr. was guilty. He knew the arsenic was there, but he also realized that the current state of science was failing the justice system. The not guilty verdict didn't mean John was innocent. It meant the science wasn't loud enough to shout down a reasonable doubt. Driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and a need for redemption, Marsh went back to his laboratory. He obsessed over finding a way to make arsenic visible, undeniable, and permanent. He needed a test that didn't just show a fleeting color change, but created a physical, tangible piece of evidence that a jury could hold in their hands. Within 3 years, he succeeded. He developed what is now known as the Marsh test. It was a brilliant piece of chemistry. By treating the suspect's sample with zinc and sulfuric acid, any arsenic present would be converted into arsine gas. When this gas was heated as it passed through a glass tube, it would deposit a distinct, silvery black metallic mirror on a cold ceramic plate. This mirror was pure arsenic. It didn't fade. It didn't change. It was the literal reflection of a killer's weapon. The Marsh test revolutionized forensic toxicology. It meant that a poisoner could no longer hide behind the invisibility of their toxin. It turned the stomach of the victim into a crime scene that could be preserved for months or even years. But what of John Bodle Jr.? While the law couldn't touch him again for his grandfather's murder due to the rules of double jeopardy, his life did not take the path of a man wrongly accused. Freed from the constraints of his grandfather's oversight, John didn't become the successful heir he imagined. Instead, his life spiraled. He continued his habits of dishonesty and petty crime. Years later, John was arrested for an unrelated fraud. Perhaps it was the weight of his past, or perhaps it was a final act of arrogance now that he was beyond the reach of the gallows for the 1833 crime. But he finally confessed. He admitted to the chaplain that he had, in fact, put the arsenic in the coffee kettle that November morning. He described how he had watched his family drink the brew, knowing exactly what was coming. He confirmed what James Marsh had known all along. He was a cold-blooded killer who had used the limitations of science to commit the perfect crime. John Bodle Jr. was eventually transported to a penal colony in Australia for his later crimes, a shadow of the man who had once thought he could buy his way into a better life with a spoonful of white powder. The case of the Bodle family is rarely remembered for the victims or even the killer. It is remembered as the catalyst, because a wealthy old man died in agony in a Kent farmhouse, and because a guilty man walked free, the world gained a tool that would catch countless killers in the century to follow. It was the moment forensic science moved out of the shadows of guesswork and into the light of objective, undeniable proof. The metallic mirror of the Marsh test didn't just reflect the arsenic. It reflected the beginning of the modern age of criminal investigation, an age where the dead could finally speak with a voice that even a skeptical jury couldn't ignore. Next story, the murder of Lloyd Magruder. Lewiston, Idaho Territory, 1863. The Bitterroot Mountains are a jagged, unforgiving spine of rock and pine that separate the modern states of Idaho and Montana. In the autumn of 1863, these peaks weren't just a geographical barrier, they were a gauntlet. The air was turning sharp with the promise of an early winter, and the trails were narrow ribbons of dirt clinging to the edges of steep ravines. This was the era of the gold rush, a time when the promise of a strike could make a man's fortune, and the journey home could cost him his life. Lloyd Magruder was a man who understood the risks of the frontier better than most. He was a merchant, a packer, and a respected figure in the fledgling community of Lewiston. He was 38 years old, a husband and a father. He wasn't a gambler or a dreamer. He was a businessman. In the summer of 1863, Magruder had assembled a massive pack train, 60 mules laden with supplies, to travel from Lewiston to the booming mining camps of Virginia City, in what was then the Idaho Territory. The journey to Virginia City had been a success. Magruder sold his goods for a literal mountain of gold dust and coins. As he prepared for the return trip, his saddlebags were heavy, containing upwards of $30,000, a staggering sum for the time, equivalent to nearly $1 million today. But Magruder was no fool. He knew that traveling alone with such wealth was a death sentence. He needed a crew. Among the men he hired were some he believed he could trust, and others who had simply made themselves available at the right time. There was Charles Lowry, David Howard, and James Romaine. He also hired two brothers, Nicholas and Philip Schaefer, and a man named William Page to help handle the stock. Finally, there were two young miners, William Phillips and Horace Chalmers, who paid for the privilege of traveling under Magruder's protection. The party set out in early October. The mood was likely one of cautious relief. The hard work was done, and the comforts of Lewiston were only a few hundred miles away. But as they climbed higher into the Nez Perce Trail, the atmosphere began to shift. The temperatures plummeted, and the group found themselves battling through premature snowdrifts. What Magruder didn't know was that he had invited the wolves into the fold. Lowry, Howard, and Romaine weren't just hired hands. They were desperate men who had been watching the gold since the moment it was weighed in Virginia City. They had spent the journey whispering in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment and the perfect location where the wilderness would swallow any evidence of their intentions. That location was a high, lonely ridge overlooking the Clearwater River, now known as Magruder's Crossing. On the night of October 11th, the camp was settled. The fire was dying down to glowing embers, and the men were wrapped in their blankets, exhausted from a long day of navigating frozen trails. Magruder was on the first watch, sitting by the fire, perhaps thinking of his family or the profit he'd secured. Behind him, the shadows moved. Lowry and Howard approached Magruder with practiced silence. In the stillness of the mountain night, the first blow was struck with an axe. It was sudden and final. Magruder never had a chance to reach for a weapon. As his body slumped, the conspirators didn't stop. They had to ensure there were no witnesses. They moved through the camp like wraiths. Lowry and Howard took the lead, while Romaine targeted the others. The Schaefer brothers, Phillips, and Chalmers were all dispatched in their sleep or in the confused moments of waking. The violence was clinical and brutal. When the echoes of the struggle finally faded, only one man besides the killers remained alive: William Page. Page hadn't participated in the planning or the execution, but he had watched in frozen terror. The killers spared him, not out of mercy, but because they needed someone who knew how to handle the mules and navigate the remaining trail. He was now their prisoner, bound to them by the blood he had seen spilled. The killers spent the next few hours cleaning up the site with a chilling level of organization. They didn't just leave the bodies where they fell. They knew that if a search party ever came looking, a stray boot or a piece of clothing could lead to the gallows. They gathered the remains of Magruder and his companions, wrapped them in blankets, and threw them over a precipice into a deep canyon. They then gathered all the camp equipment, the tents, the saddles, the personal belongings, and burned them in a massive bonfire. To finish the erasure, they led the mules into the brush and killed them, leaving the animals to rot so they wouldn't be seen with a recognizable pack train. With the gold secured in their own bags, the four men, Lowry, Howard, Romaine, and the trembling Page, continued toward Lewiston. But they didn't ride into town as a group. They knew the sight of four men arriving with Magruder's gold, but without Magruder, would raise immediate alarms. Instead, they skirted the town, abandoned their horses, and made their way to the river, hoping to catch a steamboat to Portland and then vanish into the chaos of San Francisco. They might have gotten away with it, if not for the intuition of one man, Hill Beachy. Beachy was a friend of Magruder and the owner of the Luna House Hotel in Lewiston. He was a man of keen observation and a deep sense of loyalty. When he saw three men, Lowry, Howard, and Romaine, boarding a stagecoach under assumed names and acting with a strange, nervous energy, his instincts flared. He noticed they were carrying heavy valises, and more importantly, he recognized their faces from when they had left with Magruder. Beachy went to the authorities, but they were hesitant. There was no proof of a crime, only the absence of a prominent citizen. But Beachy couldn't let it go. He had a dream, or so the legend goes, where he saw the murder in vivid, bloody detail. Driven by a conviction that bordered on obsession, he secured a warrant and set off in pursuit. The chase that followed was one of the most remarkable in the history of the American West. Beachy followed the trail to Portland, only to find the men had already sailed for San Francisco. Undeterred, he took the next ship south. In San Francisco, Beachy worked with the local police. They tracked the suspects to a mint where they were trying to convert their gold dust into coin. When the men were finally cornered, they were found with the wealth of the Magruder party. But the gold wasn't enough to hang them. In 1863, without a body or a witness, a murder conviction was nearly impossible. This is where William Page became the pivot point of history. Page, still terrified and guilt-ridden, was separated from the others. Beachy, using a combination of pressure and the promise of protection, eventually broke him. Page confessed everything. He described the ridge, the axe, the fire, and the canyon where the bodies had been discarded. The return journey to Lewiston was a tense affair. The news of the crime had spread, and the public was hungry for justice. When the boat carrying Beachy and his prisoners docked, a lynch mob was already forming. It took all of Beachy's influence and the presence of armed guards to ensure the men made it to the jail alive. He wanted a trial. He wanted the law to speak for Lloyd Magruder. The trial was a landmark event for the Idaho Territory. It was held in a makeshift courtroom, as the town was still in its infancy. Page took the stand as the star witness, his voice trembling as he recounted the horrors of that October night. The defense tried to paint him as a co-conspirator trying to save his own skin, but the details he provided were too specific, too haunting to be dismissed. While the trial was underway, a recovery party was sent into the Bitterroot Mountains, guided by Page's descriptions. They found the site exactly as he had described. Despite the winter snows, they located the charred remains of the camp and the frozen, broken bodies at the bottom of the canyon. The evidence was undeniable. On January 26, 1864, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for Lowry, Howard, and Romaine. They were sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place on March 4th. It was the first legal execution in the newly formed Idaho Territory. A scaffold was built in a natural amphitheater near the town, and thousands of people gathered to watch. The three men showed varying degrees of remorse, or lack thereof, in their final moments. Lowry was said to be stoic, while Romaine protested his innocence until the end. With the drop of the trapdoors, the saga of the Magruder murders reached its legal conclusion. But the impact on the region lasted for decades. It changed the way gold was transported and how law was administered in the territories. Hill Beachy was hailed as a hero, though he spent the rest of his life haunted by the things he had discovered in his pursuit of justice. Today, the Magruder Corridor remains one of the most wild and untouched areas in the lower 48 states. The ridge where the merchant met his end still bears his name, a silent monument to a man who did everything right, only to be betrayed by the very men he paid to protect him. The wind that whistles through the pines at Magruder's Crossing seems to carry a heavy chill, a reminder that in the high country, the line between fortune and tragedy is as thin as a mountain trail. The gold was eventually returned to Magruder's widow, though no amount of coin could fill the void left by the loss of Lloyd and his companions. The case remains a foundational story of the Old West, not just because of the scale of the crime, but because of the relentless pursuit of the truth in a land that was designed to keep secrets. As for William Page, the man who saw it all, he disappeared into the footnotes of history. Some say he lived out his days in fear, looking over his shoulder for the ghosts of the men he helped send to the gallows. In the end, the mountains kept their silence, and the trail moved on, but the name Magruder became synonymous with the dangers of the high frontier and the high price of trust. Next story, the targeted elimination of Juan Prim. Madrid, Spain, 1870. The evening of December 27th, 1870 was uncharacteristically cold, even for a Madrid winter. A thick, oppressive fog had rolled into the city, swallowing the grand limestone facades of the Calle de Alcalá and turning the flickering gas lamps into dim, amber smudges against the dark. Inside the Palacio de las Cortes, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. General Juan Prim y Prats, the most powerful man in Spain, was preparing to leave. He had just finished a session of the parliament, a session that felt like the culmination of his life's work. Prim was a man who lived by the sword and governed by a relentless, almost desperate vision for a modern Spain. He had successfully ousted a corrupt monarchy and had finally, after months of diplomatic maneuvering, secured a new king for the nation, Amadeo of Savoy. Prim was a legend in his own time, a soldier with a chest full of medals and a face that bore the weathered lines of countless campaigns. He was the progressive hero of the 1868 Glorious Revolution, a man who believed that Spain's only hope for survival was to transition into a constitutional monarchy. But in doing so, he had made himself the most hunted man in Europe. To the Republicans, he was a traitor to the dream of a leaderless state. To the Bourbon loyalists, he was a usurper who had sent Queen Isabella II into exile. To the colonial interests, he was a threat to their grip on Cuba. As Prim stepped out of the Parliament building, his boots clicking on the damp stone, he was flanked by two of his loyal adjutants. He climbed into his personal horse-drawn carriage, a heavy, velvet-lined coach. He told the driver to head to the Ministry of War. It was a short trip, a route he had taken hundreds of times. But on this night, the familiar streets of Madrid felt hollowed out by the mist. The carriage rattled down the Calle del Turco, a narrow, shadowed thoroughfare. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed off the tight walls. Suddenly, the rhythm of the journey was shattered. Two other carriages appeared out of the fog, one pulling ahead of Prim's and another flanking it. forcing his driver to pull on the reins. The horses neighed in confusion, their breath visible in the freezing air. From the shadows of the doorways and from the interior of the intercepting carriages, figures emerged. They weren't soldiers in uniform. They were men in heavy cloaks, their faces obscured by the darkness and the collars of their coats. There were 12 of them. In their hands, they carried blunderbusses, short-barreled, wide-mouthed firearms designed for maximum impact at close range. One of the men stepped toward the window of Prim's carriage. There was no demand for money, no political manifesto shouted into the night. There was only the deafening roar of gunpowder. The first blast shattered the glass, showering the interior of the coach with shards. Prim, a veteran of dozens of battles, reacted with the instinct of a soldier. He tried to shield his face with his gloved hands, but the narrow confines of the carriage left him no room to maneuver. A second shot rang out, then a third. The Calle del Turco became a corridor of smoke and fire. Lead slugs tore through the wooden panels of the carriage and into the general's body. He was hit in the shoulder, the hand, and the arm. His adjutants were also wounded, blood beginning to pool on the floorboards as they cried out in the chaos. The perpetrators didn't stay to finish their work. As quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the fog-choked labyrinth of Madrid's side streets. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunfire. Prim's driver, realizing the gravity of the situation, lashed the horses, racing toward the Ministry of War. When the carriage arrived, the scene was horrific. The man who had held the fate of Spain in his hands was helped from the coach, his uniform soaked in crimson, his face pale, but his eyes still burning with a defiant, stubborn life. He was rushed upstairs to his private quarters. Doctors were summoned in a frenzy. The official word released to the public was that the general's wounds were superficial, that he was resting and would recover to welcome the new king, who was due to arrive in Spain in just 3 days. But behind the closed doors of ministry, the reality was much darker. For 3 days, Juan Prim lingered. The lead balls from the weapons had carried bits of his clothing and the carriage's leather upholstery deep into his body. In the 19th century, this was a terminal prognosis. Infection set in almost immediately. A severe biological decay began to rot his wounds. Prim suffered in agonizing silence, trying to project strength for a government that was already beginning to fracture without his leadership. On December 30th, the very day King Amadeo I landed at the port of Cartagena, Juan Prim took his last breath. He was 56 years old. He passed away without ever seeing the king he had fought so hard to bring to the throne. The news of his end sent shockwaves through Europe. It was the first coordinated political hit in Spanish history, executed with a level of precision and brutality that suggested a massive conspiracy. But as the investigation began, the authorities found themselves staring into a void. The primary suspect was a man named Jose Paul y Angulo, a radical Republican and a former friend of Prim who had turned into a bitter enemy. Paul y Angulo had openly called for Prim's removal in his newspaper, La Comate. Witnesses claimed to have seen him at the scene, and he eventually fled the country, spending the rest of his life in exile, haunted by the accusation. But many historians argue that Paul y Angulo was merely a pawn, a loudmouth radical used to provide cover for a much deeper, more aristocratic plot. Then there was the Duke of Montpensier, Antoine d'Orleans. He was a man of immense wealth and even greater ambition. He had funded the revolution that toppled Queen Isabella, but his ultimate goal was to take the throne for himself. Prim had blocked him at every turn, famously saying that Montpensier would never be king. The Duke had the motive and the money to hire a dozen men, but the evidence against him remained circumstantial, buried under layers of political protection. The investigation into Prim's passing became one of the longest-running legal farces in Spanish history. The Sumario, or case file, eventually grew to over 18,000 pages. It was a document filled with contradictions, retracted statements, and lost evidence. Over the years, judges who pushed too hard for the truth were reassigned. Witnesses disappeared or suddenly developed amnesia. It became clear that the powers that be in Madrid had no interest in finding out who had taken out the general, because the truth likely pointed to the very foundations of the new government. For over a century, the official story remained. Prim succumbed to his wounds and the subsequent infection 3 days after the attack. But the story didn't end in 1870. In 2012, a team of forensic scientists and historians received permission to exhume the body of Juan Prim. His remains had been mummified, preserved in a lead-lined coffin in the town of Reyes. When the researchers opened the casket, they were met with a chilling sight. The general was perfectly preserved, still wearing his uniform, his eyes covered by silver coins. The forensic examination, led by the Prim Commission, revealed something the history books had ignored for 142 years. They found deep grooves around Prim's neck, marks that strongly suggested he had been strangled. The theory proposed by the commission was a bombshell. Prim had survived the initial ambush. While he was lying in his bed at the Ministry of War, weakened by fever and infection, someone had entered his room, someone he likely knew and trusted. While the doctors were away, or the guard were looking the other way, this individual had used a cord or a hand to finish what the blunderbusses had started. They ensured the general would never speak again. This would explain the desperate attempts by the government to keep his room isolated and to claim he was recovering. They weren't waiting for him to get better. They were waiting for him to be gone. If this theory is true, it means Juan Prim was the victim of a double plot, betrayed first on the street and then in his own bed. The forensic evidence, however, is still a matter of fierce debate. Other experts argued that the marks on the neck were caused by the natural drying of the skin during the mummification process or by the tightness of his military tunic. The controversy only added to the legend. The removal of Juan Prim changed the course of Spanish history forever. Without his protection and his iron will, the reign of King Amadeo I lasted only 2 years. The king, frustrated by a country that seemed ungovernable and haunted by the ghost of the man who had invited him, eventually abdicated and left, calling the Spaniards impossible. Spain plummeted into years of civil war, instability, and eventually the restoration of the very Bourbon line Prim had sought to replace. Today, the Calle del Turco has been renamed Calle del Marqués de Cubas, but a small plaque marks the spot where the carriage was stopped. The damage to the walls has long since been repaired, but the questions remain. Who gave the order? Was it the radical journalist, the ambitious duke, or perhaps a shadow cabinet of generals who feared Prim was becoming too powerful? We see Prim in portraits as a man of action, a man who believed he could steer the chaotic currents of 19th century politics by sheer force of personality. But in the end, he was caught in a trap set by the very world he helped create. The fog of that December night in Madrid has never truly lifted. It remains one of history's most enduring cold cases, a story of a man who gave everything to build a new nation, only to be discarded by it in the most brutal way possible. The general's final days weren't just a struggle against infection. They were a struggle against a conspiracy that reached into the highest halls of power. Whether he was taken by the lead in his shoulder or a hand at his throat, the result was the same. The light of the Spanish Enlightenment was dimmed, and the man who held the torch was left to rot in a leaden casket, taking his secrets to the grave. If you ever find yourself in Madrid, walking through the narrow streets near the Parliament, you might feel a chill that has nothing to do with the wind. It's the lingering echo of a carriage stopping, the smell of acrid smoke, and the realization that in the game of crowns, there is no such thing as a clean escape. Next story, the murder of Antoinette Smith. Wicklow Mountains, Ireland, 1987. On a humid Saturday night in July 1987, the Marlay Park concert grounds in Dublin were vibrating with the sound of 30,000 fans. It was the height of summer, and David Bowie's Glass Spider tour had descended on the city. Among the sea of faces was 27-year-old Antoinette Smith, known as Angie to those closest to her. She was a mother of 2 young daughters, described as a woman whose world revolved around her children. This night was a rare, hard-earned break, a chance to lose herself in the music and the atmosphere of a Dublin summer. But as the final notes of the encore faded and the massive crowd began to funnel out into the night, Antoinette began a journey that would remain a mystery for nearly a year. and a tragedy that would haunt the Irish landscape for decades to come. Antoinette had traveled to the concert with a friend. After the show ended around 11 p.m., the two made their way back toward the city center. The energy was still high, the streets filled with people trying to catch buses or find taxis. They eventually made their way to La Mirage Disco on Parnell Street, a popular spot at the time. They stayed there until the early hours of Sunday morning, July 12th. When the club finally began to empty out around 2:15 a.m., Antoinette and her friend parted ways. Witnesses would later recall seeing Antoinette outside the club, and some reported seeing her at a taxi rank on O'Connell Street. She was dressed in a dark blue denim jacket with a David Bowie badge pinned to the lapel, a printed t-shirt, and blue jeans. She was petite, easy to spot, yet she seemed to simply vanish into the thinning crowd of late-night revelers. When she didn't return to her home in Clondalkin that morning, the alarm was raised almost immediately. Antoinette wasn't the type to disappear. She was a devoted mother. Her life was structured, predictable, and full of love for her family. Her husband and friends knew something was terribly wrong. As days turned into weeks, the Gardaí, Ireland's national police, launched a missing persons investigation. They retraced her steps from Marlay Park to the city centre, interviewed concertgoers, and scoured the streets of Dublin, but the trail went cold at the taxi rank. For 9 months, the Smith family lived in a state of suspended grief. Every time the phone rang or a knock came at the door, there was the flickering hope of a return, shadowed by the growing dread of the unknown. That dread was realized on April 3rd, 1988, Easter Sunday. High in the Wicklow Mountains, near the summit of Glendew Mountain and close to the border with County Dublin, a group of people were walking through the rugged, peat-covered terrain. This area is breathtakingly beautiful, but notoriously unforgiving, often shrouded in mist and far removed from the bustle of the city below. In a shallow, improvised grave, the remains of Antoinette Smith were discovered. The location was significant. It wasn't a place one would stumble upon by accident. It was a remote stretch of bogland, indicating that whoever had brought her there was likely familiar with the winding, narrow roads of the Wicklow Mountains. The autopsy would reveal a grim reality. Antoinette had been manually strangled. She had been subjected to a violent assault before her life was taken. The discovery shifted the investigation from a missing persons case to a cold-blooded murder inquiry. The Gardaí now had a crime scene, but it was one that had been exposed to the harsh Irish elements for 9 months. Much of the physical evidence had been degraded by the acidic peat and the mountain weather. However, the location itself provided a chilling clue. The Wicklow Mountains have a dark history in the Irish consciousness. To the people of Dublin, they are a weekend escape, but to the criminal element, they have often served as a dumping ground. The fact that Antoinette ended up there suggested her killer had a vehicle and the cold composure to drive 20 miles out of the city with a victim, navigating dark mountain passes in the dead of night. The investigation focused heavily on the timeline between 2:15 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. on that Sunday in July. Investigators believe that Antoinette may have been picked up by someone she thought she could trust, perhaps someone posing as a taxi driver or a gypsy cab, which were common in Dublin at the time. There is also the possibility that she was abducted by force, though no witnesses reported a struggle in the busy city center. As the years passed, the case began to grow cold, but it never left the public mind. It became part of a darker narrative that began to emerge in Ireland during the 1990s. This period saw a string of disappearances and murders of young women in an area that the media eventually dubbed the Vanishing Triangle. While Antoinette Smith's murder predated the disappearances of women like Annie McCarrick, Deirdre Jacob, and Jojo Dullard, her case is often discussed in the same breath. The similarities were hard to ignore. Young women, often alone, vanishing from the streets or roadsides, their bodies, if found, located in remote, rural areas like the Wicklow Mountains. Investigators began to look for a common thread. Was there a single predator stalking the roads of Leinster? Several names surfaced over the years. Some were local men with histories of violence. Others were more notorious figures already behind bars for similar crimes. One name that frequently arises in discussions of the Vanishing Triangle is Larry Murphy, a man convicted of a brutal assault in the same mountain range in 2000. However, Murphy would have been quite young at the time of Antoinette's murder, and despite intensive questioning and investigation, no forensic link has ever been established between him and her death. In the decades since 1987, the Gardaí have never truly closed a file. Every few years, on the anniversary of her disappearance or the discovery of her body, fresh appeals are made. They look for that one person who saw something at the taxi rank, or someone who remembers a friend or relative coming home that night acting strangely, perhaps with scratches on their face or blood on their clothes. The tragedy of Antoinette Smith isn't just in her death, but in the life that was stolen. Her daughters grew up without a mother, navigating their milestones, graduations, weddings, the birth of their own children, with a permanent hollow space where Antoinette should have been. Her family has remained vocal, refusing to let her name be forgotten, frequently appearing in the media to plead for the wall of silence to finally break. The difficulty in these decades-old cases often lies in the lack of modern technology at the time. In 1987, there were no CCTV cameras on every street corner. There were no GPS trackers in cars or cell tower pings to trace a suspect's movements. The investigation relied on shoe-leather detective work and the memories of witnesses who were often under the influence of alcohol after a long night out at a concert and a club. Yet, there is hope in the advancement of science. Forensic technology has leaped forward in ways that were unimaginable in 1988. Samples that were once considered too small or too degraded can now yield DNA profiles. The Gardaí have indicated that they continue to review the physical evidence in Antoinette's case, hoping that a microscopic trace of her killer might finally be identified. There is also the psychological aspect of the killer. Criminal profilers suggest that whoever killed Antoinette didn't just snap. The act of strangulation is intimate and requires sustained, deliberate force. The act of transporting her to Glendu Mountain requires planning and a level of comfort with the landscape. It is highly unlikely that this was the killer's only act of violence. This leads to the haunting question, who else did they hurt? And are they still out there? In recent years, the cold case unit of the Gardaí has taken a fresh look at the vanishing triangle cases, including Antoinette's. They're looking for patterns that might have been missed in the 80s and 90s, cross-referencing statements and alibis with modern investigative techniques. The case of Antoinette Smith remains one of Ireland's most heartbreaking unsolveds. It represents a loss of innocence for a city that, in 1987, felt like a smaller, safer place. It serves as a reminder that behind every cold case headline is a human being, a Bowie fan, a friend, a mother, who went out for a night of music and never came home. As it stands today, the file on Antoinette Smith is open. The Wicklow Mountains still hold their secrets, the peat bogs keeping their silent vigil over the site where she was found. But for the investigators and her family, the search for the truth continues. They believe that the answer lies in a memory, a confession, or a tiny fragment of DNA. They believe that someone, somewhere, knows exactly what happened in the early hours of July 12, 1987. And until that person speaks, or the evidence speaks for them, the ghost of that summer night will continue to haunt the Irish hills.